the day Japan's Navy died. June 19th, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stands on the bridge of Japan's newest aircraft carrier, Taiho, watching the sun rise over the Pacific. Around him, 9 carriers carry over 400 aircraft. Behind him, battleships and cruisers form the most powerful fleet Japan has assembled since midway 2 years ago. He believes, absolutely, completely, without doubt, that by nightfall the American Pacific Fleet will be crippled and Japan will negotiate peace from a position of strength. He has planned for every contingency. His pilots have trained for this exact moment. His strategy exploits every advantage Japanese naval aviation possesses. 300 miles to the east, a 23-year-old American radar operator named Clifford O'Brien stares at a green phosphorescent screen in the Combat Information Center of the battleship USS Alabama. He's watching something that makes his pulse quicken. Blips, dozens of them, then scores, appearing at the extreme edge of his display like a swarm of angry wasps. Enemy aircraft, over 140 miles away, heading straight for the American fleet. O'Brien's report goes up the chain of command in seconds. Within minutes, every ship in Task Force 58 knows what's coming. The warning gives them nearly 30 minutes to prepare their response. 30 minutes that Admiral Ozawa doesn't know he's lost. The Japanese commander believes his pilots will achieve surprise. O'Brien's radar has just made surprise impossible. What follows in the next 12 hours will become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the most one-sided aerial battle in naval history. By sunset, over 350 Japanese aircraft will be shot from the sky. 3 carriers will sink beneath the waves. Japanese naval aviation will cease to exist as an effective fighting force. And Admiral Ozawa will learn, too late, that the war he thought he was fighting ended 2 years ago. The enemy he faces now is nothing like the enemy he remembers. This is the story of how an entire fleet sailed confidently into a massacre they couldn't see coming. How assumptions that had once been true became fatal lies. How warriors discovered that courage alone cannot overcome technology, training, and industrial might combined. This is the story of the day Japan's Navy died. The miscalculation began long before the first aircraft launched, built on assumptions about Japanese strengths and American weaknesses that had once been accurate, but were accurate no longer. Japanese carrier aircraft possessed significantly greater range than their American counterparts. A Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber could fly 300 miles to its target and return. An American Grumman TBF Avenger could manage perhaps 250 miles. This difference meant Japanese carriers could theoretically strike from beyond the range where American aircraft could counterattack, stay outside their reach, devastate their fleet, recover safely. Ozawa planned to exploit this advantage with ruthless precision. The plan contained another element that seemed to guarantee victory. Ozawa expected approximately 500 land-based aircraft from Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's 1st Air Fleet to attack the Americans from airfields on Guam, Rota, and Yap in the Mariana Islands. These land-based aircraft would destroy roughly 1/3 of the American carriers before Ozawa's fleet even engaged. Then his carrier aircraft would employ shuttle bombing, striking the Americans and landing on Guam to refuel and rearm rather than returning directly to the carriers. This would allow multiple strikes per day while conserving fuel, multiplying Japanese striking power far beyond what carrier aircraft alone could deliver. The concept was elegant, sophisticated, based on careful analysis of comparative capabilities. It was also based on intelligence that was catastrophically outdated. Admiral Somu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, shared Ozawa's absolute confidence in Japanese superiority. Before the operation commenced, he issued a fleet order explicitly invoking the memory of Admiral Hihikaro Togo's legendary victory over the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima in 1905. The fate of the empire rests on this one battle, Toyota declared in language designed to inspire supreme effort. Every man shall do his utmost. The words echoed those Togo himself had signaled before destroying the Russian fleet 4 decades earlier. Japanese officers understood the comparison. They were being asked to deliver victory of similar magnitude, to demonstrate that Japanese spirit could overcome superior numbers just as it had against the Russians. But the assumptions underlying Operation Ago had already collapsed completely. American carrier task forces under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher had conducted devastating raids against the Mariana Islands between June 11th and 15th, just days before Ozawa's fleet approached. Hellcat fighters swept over Guam, Saipan, Rota, and Tinian in carefully coordinated strikes that demonstrated exactly how much American capabilities had evolved since 1942. They destroyed Japanese aircraft on the ground before they could take off, shot down those that rose to challenge them, bombed anti-aircraft positions, burned hangars, detonated fuel dumps in spectacular explosions that could be seen for miles. Of the 500 aircraft Ozawa confidently expected to support his operation, fewer than 50 remained operational by the time his fleet approached. Vice Admiral Kakuta, commanding the decimated 1st Air Fleet, either through catastrophic miscommunication or unwillingness to admit the magnitude of his failure, never accurately reported these losses to Ozawa. Messages between the two commanders were vague about precise aircraft numbers, bureaucratic language designed to soften disaster. Ozawa interpreted ambiguous reports optimistically, seeing what he wanted to see rather than confronting reality. He sailed toward the decisive battle, believing he commanded robust land-based air support that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The Japanese pilots themselves presented an even more fundamental problem that Ozawa's planning had not adequately addressed. They were not the warriors their predecessors had been. At Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the average Japanese naval aviator had accumulated approximately 700 hours of flight time before entering combat. These were elite professionals who had trained for years under the most rigorous selection and instruction programs in the world. They could navigate across thousands of miles of open Pacific using only dead reckoning and occasional star fixes. They could place torpedoes with devastating accuracy against maneuvering warships at high speed. They were masters of their craft, and their skill had won Japan an empire in 6 months. But those supremely skilled aviators were mostly dead by June 1944. They had fallen in the skies over Midway, where 4 carriers and their irreplaceable air groups were lost in a single day. They had died in the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign, where daily combat over Guadalcanal bled Japanese naval aviation for months. They had perished in desperate battles across the Central Pacific as American forces island-hopped toward Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy had never developed a systematic program for rotating experienced pilots home to serve as instructors. The doctrine assumed that the best pilots should always be at the front, leading by example, maximizing combat effectiveness. It was a philosophy that made sense in the short term. It was catastrophic in the long term. The veterans flew combat missions until they were killed, taking their accumulated knowledge and hard-won skills with them to the bottom of the Pacific. No institutional mechanism existed to capture their expertise and pass it to the next generation. By June 1944, Japanese pilot training had deteriorated to levels that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Severe fuel shortages imposed by American submarine attacks on Japanese tankers cut flight hours drastically. Training that had once required 2 years was compressed to 6 months, then 3 months. The rigorous pre-war selection programs that accepted only the most talented candidates from thousands of applicants were abandoned in favor of mass enrollment to fill empty cockpits. Experienced instructors who should have been teaching new pilots were instead sent to operational squadrons to replace combat losses, further degrading training quality in a vicious cycle where need consumed the very resources required to rebuild capability. Many of the pilots aboard Ozawa's carriers had received fewer than 6 months of total flight training. Some had never successfully completed an arrested carrier landing before deploying for combat operations. They practiced on land-based runways with painted lines, then reported to their squadrons and hoped they'd figure it out when it mattered. American intelligence officers who interrogated captured Japanese aviators later in the war were genuinely shocked to discover that by late 1944 and into 1945, some replacement pilots entered combat with as few as 40 total flight hours. These young men could barely control their aircraft in basic flight, let alone fight in them against experienced enemies. The contrast with American naval aviation could not have been starker or more consequential. United States Navy pilot training programs required a minimum of 525 hours of flight time before any aviator could be assigned to a combat squadron. The pilots of Task Force 58 who would face Ozawa's air groups averaged considerably more than that minimum, and a substantial number were veterans of earlier carrier battles at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons. They had learned through hard experience what worked and what got pilots killed. They had developed tactics through trial and error, testing them in combat where mistakes meant death. They had survived not through luck but through skill, and that survival made them exponentially more dangerous. American aviators flew aircraft designed with pilot survival as a primary consideration, a fundamental philosophical difference that reflected how each nation valued its warriors. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat featured armor plating around the cockpit to protect the pilot from enemy fire. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, designed to close off bullet holes automatically rather than leaking gasoline that would ignite. Its 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney engine provided enough power to escape from disadvantageous situations rather than forcing pilots to fight their way out. The aircraft was designed on the assumption that pilots would sometimes be hit. It gave them the best possible chance of surviving to fight again, to learn from the experience, to become even more effective. The Japanese had taken the opposite approach. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 achieved its remarkable range and maneuverability through extreme weight reduction that eliminated pilot armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and even structural strength in favor of performance. A Zero that took hits would burn or break apart. This was an acceptable trade-off when cockpits were filled with irreplaceable masters of their craft who rarely made mistakes that resulted in taking fire. It was a catastrophically poor trade-off when those cockpits were filled with poorly trained novices flying against battle-hardened veterans in superior aircraft. Ozawa knew nothing about the American system of radar-directed fighter control that would doom his attacks before they began. American carriers had developed sophisticated combat information centers where trained officers tracked incoming raids on radar screens and directed friendly fighters to intercept them while still far from a fleet. The system used radio communications to vector Hellcats to precise intercept positions with altitude advantage over approaching enemy formations. A handful of skilled fighter direction officers could coordinate hundreds of aircraft with precision that Japanese forces, still dependent on visual observation and voice radio, without centralized control, could not begin to match. When Ozawa's pilots approached Task Force 58, they would not achieve the surprise their attack plan assumed. They would fly into carefully prepared ambushes by fighters that had been positioned to destroy them. The Americans possessed another decisive advantage that Ozawa did not even suspect existed. Their anti-aircraft shells were equipped with a secret weapon designated the VT proximity fuse. Developed at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. These revolutionary fuses used a miniature radio transmitter and receiver built into the shell itself to detect when it passed near an aircraft. The fuse would detonate automatically at the optimal moment for maximum destructive effect, rather than requiring either an extremely lucky direct hit or a precisely timed mechanical fuse setting. The electronic components of the proximity fuse represented remarkable engineering achievements. They had to withstand acceleration forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity during the instant of firing. They had to survive spinning at 25,000 rotations per minute throughout the shell's flight. They had to function reliably in the harsh conditions of naval combat: salt spray, temperature extremes, violent ship motion. That American industry could mass-produce such sophisticated devices by the millions testified to capabilities Japanese planners had completely failed to anticipate. Conventional anti-aircraft fire using time-fused shells required precise prediction of exactly where a fast-moving aircraft would be when the shell arrived and detonated at a preset time. Against maneuvering targets, the mathematics were essentially impossible. Perhaps one shell in 1,000 actually destroyed its intended target. Proximity-fused shells changed this equation dramatically. They proved 3 to 4 times more effective than conventional time fuses under combat conditions. In 1943, though only approximately 1/4 of American anti-aircraft ammunition used the secret VT fuses, that quarter accounted for more than half of all enemy aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The Japanese pilots approaching Task Force 58 on June 19th would fly into a wall of exploding steel far deadlier than anything they had encountered in training or imagined in their nightmares. Perhaps most critically, Ozawa and his staff completely failed to appreciate what they faced in the Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter that equipped American carrier squadrons. This aircraft had been designed specifically to counter the Mitsubishi Zero, incorporating detailed lessons learned from American pilots who had fought against Japan's legendary fighter and survived to describe precisely what made it dangerous and where its weaknesses lay. The Zero achieved its extraordinary agility through extreme weight savings that sacrificed everything for performance. The Hellcat took a fundamentally different approach. It protected the pilot while still delivering performance superior to the Zero in the flight regimes where combat was actually decided. The Hellcat was not more maneuverable than the Zero at low speeds in a turning fight. In that narrow circumstance, the lighter Japanese fighter would win every time. But American pilots were trained never to engage in low-speed turning fights against Zeros. Instead, Hellcat pilots used the altitude advantage provided by radar fighter direction to dive on Japanese formations from above, fire concentrated bursts from 6 heavy .50 caliber machine guns that could shred unarmored aircraft, then use their superior speed in the dive and climb to escape before the more agile Zeros could turn to engage. The tactic was not elegant or sporting or romantic. It was calculated industrial-age killing, and it was devastatingly effective against opponents who had been trained for a different kind of air combat entirely. Opponents who expected honorable one-on-one duels, not coordinated ambushes from optimal positions. The morning of June 19th began with American submarines delivering the first blows before any aircraft launched from either fleet. USS Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, had been stalking Ozawa's formation through the darkness. At 8:10 in the morning, Blanchard maneuvered his submarine into attack position against the massive carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced fleet carrier, commissioned just 3 months earlier in March 1944. Blanchard faced a problem. His torpedo data computer, the mechanical calculator that determined the precise firing solution for his torpedoes, had malfunctioned during the approach. The device that was supposed to solve the complex geometry of hitting a moving target from a moving platform wasn't working. Rather than break off the attack, Blanchard decided to fire anyway, using visual estimation of the target's course and speed, spreading 6 torpedoes across Taiho's projected track to maximize the probability of at least one hitting. What happened next entered the permanent records of Japanese naval sacrifice and heroism. Warrant Officer Seikyo Komatsu, piloting a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber that had just launched from Taiho's flight deck, spotted the white torpedo wakes streaking toward his ship through the clear Pacific water below. The trails were clearly visible in the morning sun, white lines cutting through blue water, pointing like arrows toward the carrier that held 2,000 of his comrades. Without hesitation, without orders, without time for conscious thought, Komatsu pushed his aircraft into a steep dive directly toward one of the incoming torpedoes. He deliberately crashed his plane into its path, sacrificing himself and his crew to protect their carrier. The aircraft and torpedo exploded together in a fountain of spray and debris. The detonation was visible from Taiho's bridge, a pillar of white water rising hundreds of feet, evidence of extraordinary courage. It was an act of selfless bravery that reduced the number of torpedoes reaching Taiho from 6 to 5. But one torpedo was enough. A single weapon struck Taiho's starboard side near the forward elevator, rupturing aviation fuel storage tanks and jamming the forward aircraft elevator in its raised position. The impact created a gap in the armored flight deck, a wound that seemed manageable to the ship's officers. Taiho maintained near-flank speed, continued launching and recovering aircraft for the morning strikes. Captain Toshikazu Omeshi, serving as Ozawa's chief of staff, believed the situation was under control. Damage reports indicated flooding was contained. The ship could still operate, but the ruptured fuel tanks were steadily leaking volatile aviation gasoline into the ship's interior spaces, and an inexperienced damage control officer made a decision that would prove catastrophically fatal. Intending to clear the dangerous fumes from the ship, he ordered the ventilation system open to maximum power. The logic seemed sound. Pump fresh air through the ship, blow the gasoline vapors overboard, eliminate the explosive hazard. Instead, the powerful fans spread the fumes throughout Taiho's enclosed interior spaces. Every ventilation duct became a pathway for gasoline vapor to reach new compartments. By noon, both hangar decks were saturated with invisible explosive fumes. Japan's newest carrier had become a floating bomb, waiting for the slightest spark to ignite it. 3 hours after Blanchard's attack on Taiho, another American submarine found another Japanese carrier presenting an irresistible target. USS Kavala, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler, was conducting her very first war patrol. This was Kavala's maiden combat deployment. The crew was green, untested, had never faced the enemy before. Kostler had patiently tracked the fleet carrier Shokaku through his periscope as she maneuvered to recover aircraft returning from the morning strike. Shokaku was one of the most famous warships in the Japanese fleet, a Pearl Harbor veteran that had been among the 6 carriers launching the December 7th attack. She had fought at Coral Sea, at Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz. She was among the most battle-tested carriers afloat. At 11:18, Kostler fired 6 torpedoes from a range of 1,200 yards, point-blank range in submarine warfare. 3 struck Shokaku's starboard side in rapid succession. 1 torpedo hit the forward aviation fuel tanks. Another detonated near the forward bomb storage magazines. The third struck amidships. Aircraft that were being refueled on the hangar deck exploded into flames as burning aviation gasoline from ruptured fuel lines rained down on damaged control parties desperately trying to contain the spreading fires. Within minutes, uncontrollable conflagrations were spreading through multiple compartments. The crew fought with extraordinary courage and discipline, but the damage was simply too extensive. By early afternoon, flames were visibly spouting from Shokaku's flight deck. Internal bulkheads were failing. The ship was dying. At 2:08 in the afternoon, bombs in the forward magazines detonated in a massive internal explosion that broke the carrier's back, a catastrophic blast that tore the ship in two. Shokaku sank in approximately 3 minutes, taking over 1,260 officers and men with her to the bottom. Nearly 400 air crew who had just returned from the morning strikes went down with the ship, experienced aviators who could never be replaced. It was the worst single-ship casualty in the history of Japan's carrier striking force. Ozawa, still aboard the stricken Taiho, did not yet know his fleet had lost 2 carriers to submarine attack within hours. Communication between ships was difficult. Radio silence was maintained to avoid giving the Americans information about the fleet's position. He remained focused on the airstrikes he had launched against the American fleet beginning at 8:30 that morning, still confident that his carefully planned operation was unfolding successfully. The first Japanese raid consisted of 68 aircraft, mostly Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters escorting Yokosuka D, 4 Judy dive bombers, and Nakajima B-6 NGIL torpedo planes. They flew in disciplined formation toward the coordinates where Japanese scout aircraft had reported the American fleet. The pilots had been briefed on their targets and attack procedures. They believed they would catch the Americans by surprise, strike before fighters could launch, inflict devastating damage. They did not know that every mile of their approach was being tracked on glowing green radar screens aboard American ships, still over 100 miles away. Aboard USS Lexington, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's flagship, Lieutenant Joseph Eggert served as fighter director officer in the ship's Combat Information Center. Eggert had trained extensively for exactly this situation, coordinating defensive fighter patrols against incoming raids using radar information to position interceptors optimally. When radar operators reported the incoming Japanese raid at extreme range, Eggert had time to launch every available Hellcat fighter and vector them into optimal intercept positions well before the enemy could reach the fleet. He broadcast the traditional fighter scramble call. Within 15 minutes, over 200 Hellcats were airborne, climbing hard for altitude, heading west to meet the incoming Japanese. The fighters were stacked at different altitudes and positioned to attack from above and behind, exactly where poorly trained Japanese pilots would be most vulnerable. Lieutenant Junior Grade Charles Sims provided Eggert with an additional invaluable advantage that amplified the radar information. SIMS was a Japanese-language specialist stationed in Lexington's Combat Information Center, specifically to monitor enemy radio frequencies. As the Japanese air coordinator directed his pilots toward the American fleet, SIMS listened to every transmission in real time, translating the information and relaying it immediately to Eggert. The Americans knew the incoming formation's altitude, heading, composition, and tactical intentions before the Japanese pilots could even see the ships they were supposed to attack. It was like playing poker with marked cards, an advantage so overwhelming it hardly seemed fair. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer of Fighting Squadron 15, flying from the carrier USS Essex, led the first group of Hellcats to make contact with the incoming Japanese raid. He found the enemy formation approximately 55 miles from Task Force 58, still well beyond visual range of the carriers, exactly where Eggert had predicted they would be. The Japanese were flying in tight formation, presenting perfect targets for diving attacks from above. Brewer immediately led his fighters into the attack, diving from 20,000 feet with the sun behind them. He lined up the enemy formation leader, close to approximately 800 feet directly behind his target, and sent the Japanese aircraft spinning into the sea with a single accurate burst from his 6 machine guns. Without pausing to watch it fall, Brewer selected another target and destroyed it within seconds. Then another. In rapid succession, he shot down 4 enemy aircraft before Japanese fighters could effectively respond to the sudden assault from above and behind. The methodical destruction that followed gave the Battle of the Philippine Sea its enduring nickname. American pilots found themselves attacking formations of poorly trained Japanese aviators who struggled desperately to maintain formation cohesion under the unexpected onslaught. The Japanese pilots fought with courage. Individual acts of bravery were everywhere. Pilots pressing attacks against overwhelming odds, refusing to break off even when their aircraft were damaged and burning. But individual courage could not compensate for inadequate training when facing superior aircraft flown by veterans who had been positioned for perfect attacks by radar direction. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vrashu of Fighting Squadron 16 returned to Lexington after the morning engagement, having shot down 4 Japanese aircraft. During his debriefing in the squadron ready room, the young pilot from Indiana, who had grown up hunting with his father in the fields around East Chicago, reached for a comparison from his youth to describe what he had witnessed. It was just like an old-time turkey shoot, Vrashu told the intelligence officers recording his account. The vivid phrase captured something essential about the one-sided nature of the combat, and it spread rapidly through the task force as pilots shared their experiences. By the end of that terrible day, aviators across the American fleet were calling the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The statistics from the first raid justified the grim humor of that nickname. Of the 68 aircraft that had launched so confidently from Ozawa's carriers that morning, more than 42 were destroyed before they could reach the American fleet. The handful that penetrated through the fighter screen and the murderous anti-aircraft fire scored only a single bomb hit on the battleship USS South Dakota. The bomb killed 27 American sailors and wounded 23 others. Each death was a tragedy, each wounded man a cost of war. But the hit did not significantly affect South Dakota's fighting capability. The battleship remained in action, her guns still firing. 42 Japanese aircraft and their crews had been sacrificed for that single bomb hit, an exchange ratio that no military force could sustain for long. The second Japanese raid was substantially larger and fared proportionally even worse. 107 aircraft launched from Ozawa's carriers at 8:56 that morning, a massive strike that represented a significant portion of his remaining air strength. American radar detected them at 11:07 at a range of approximately 115 miles, again providing ample warning for fighter interception. Hellcats vectored by the Combat Information Centers intercepted the formation while it was still 60 miles from the fleet and methodically tore it to pieces over the next hour. 97 of the 107 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Only 10 damaged survivors made it back to their carriers to report the disaster. Pilots who had watched their comrades die around them, who had seen formations disintegrate under coordinated attacks, who returned with tales that seemed almost impossible to believe. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from Essex, achieved the most devastating individual performance of the day. Encountering a large formation of approximately 80 enemy aircraft, McCampbell led his fighters in repeated diving attacks through the Japanese formation. The tactics were textbook Hellcat doctrine: dive from above, fire a concentrated burst, use speed to escape before the enemy can react, climb back to altitude, repeat. In a single extended engagement that morning, he personally destroyed 5 Yokosuka D, 4 wide dive bombers in rapid succession, becoming an ace in a single sortie. 5 kills in one mission, enough to earn the coveted designation that distinguished the elite among fighter pilots. Later that afternoon, flying a second mission over Guam, where surviving Japanese aircraft were attempting to land and refuel, he added 2 more Mitsubishi Zeros to his score. McCampbell's 7 confirmed kills in a single day made him the Navy's leading ace of the battle. His Medal of Honor citation would note that he struck fiercely in valiant defense of our surface force. By November 1944, continuing to fly combat missions and subsequent operations, McCampbell would accumulate 34 confirmed aerial victories, the highest total achieved by any American Navy pilot during a single combat deployment in the entire war. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vrashu of Fighting Squadron 16 demonstrated with particular clarity what a skilled Hellcat pilot could accomplish against inadequately trained opponents in inferior aircraft. Despite an engine malfunction that sprayed oil across his windscreen and limited his maximum altitude to 20,000 feet, problems that would have grounded many pilots, Vrashu dove into a formation of Judy dive bombers heading for the American carriers. In just 8 minutes of concentrated combat, he shot down 6 enemy aircraft using only 360 rounds of ammunition from his total load of 2,400 rounds, an average of approximately 60 bullets per kill, a display of aerial marksmanship that reflected years of training and natural talent. When Vrashu landed on Lexington after his second sortie of the day, he climbed from his cockpit and held up 6 fingers for the ship's photographer, grinning broadly despite his exhaustion. The resulting image of the young pilot displaying his score became one of the iconic photographs of the entire Pacific War, a snapshot of American triumph that would appear in newspapers across the country. Admiral Mitcher, watching from his flag bridge high above the flight deck, permitted himself a rare smile at the sight. The taciturn admiral was not given to displays of emotion, but even he could recognize an extraordinary performance when he saw one. In the ready room below, Vrashu described what he had witnessed during the aerial combat with the frank disbelief of a man who couldn't quite believe what he'd just experienced. All of a sudden, the battle was over, he recalled years later in interviews. I looked around at the sky, and all I could see were Hellcats flying in every direction and pieces of Japanese airplanes falling into the water. The third Japanese raid of 47 aircraft achieved essentially nothing. Intercepted approximately 50 miles from the American fleet, only 7 aircraft were shot down, but the majority of the remainder became hopelessly disoriented in the chaos of combat and subsequent evasive maneuvering. They returned to their carriers without pressing any attacks on American ships. Their poorly trained pilots had lost formation integrity in the confusion, lost their bearings in the clouds and smoke, and could not locate the enemy fleet they were supposed to strike. The fourth and final raid of approximately 82 aircraft suffered perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Staff officers aboard Ozawa's carriers made a critical error in calculating the current position of the American fleet based on earlier scouting reports. They provided incorrect coordinates to the strike leader, navigation data that was wrong by dozens of miles, enough to matter tremendously in the vast Pacific. The Japanese formation flew to where the Americans were supposed to be according to the erroneous data and found only empty ocean. By the time the error was recognized and the pilots began searching for their actual targets, fuel was running critically low. These aircraft didn't have unlimited range. They had to find the Americans soon or they wouldn't have enough fuel to get home. 49 aircraft from the fourth raid attempted to land on the airfield at Orode on Guam to refuel before either continuing their attack or returning to the carriers. They had been told the base would be ready to receive them with fuel, ammunition, and maintenance support, part of Ozawa's shuttle bombing plan. Instead, they discovered that American bombing had cratered the runways and that Hellcat fighters were waiting in ambush above the field, specifically positioned to prevent exactly what Ozawa's plan required. American pilots had maintained continuous combat air patrols over Guam throughout the day for precisely this purpose. When the fourth raid's exhausted survivors approached Orote Field in their fuel-starved aircraft, they flew directly into a carefully prepared slaughter. 30 aircraft were shot down in the landing pattern, exploding over the very runways their pilots had desperately hoped would offer sanctuary and survival. The handful of survivors who managed to crash land on the damaged airstrips found their aircraft too badly damaged by the rough landings to ever fly again. Not a single aircraft from the fourth Japanese raid would ever return to Ozawa's carriers. Among the American pilots killed during the fighting over Guam was Commander Charles Brewer himself, the squadron leader who had made first contact with the incoming raids that morning and opened the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot with his devastating initial attack. Pressing his attacks aggressively at low altitude against Japanese aircraft attempting to land, Brewer lost the altitude advantage that had protected American pilots throughout the day. Several Zeros caught him from behind before he could climb away. The brave officer who had led the first successful interception did not survive to see the conclusion of the battle he had helped begin. His Navy Cross was awarded posthumously to a widow who would raise their children alone. By sunset on June 19th, Ozawa had lost approximately 350 carrier aircraft out of the 373 he had launched in his four major strikes. American combat losses totaled just 23 aircraft. The exchange ratio exceeded 15-1 in favor of the defenders. Then came the long-delayed catastrophe aboard the carrier Taiho. At 2:32 that afternoon, the aviation gasoline vapors that had been silently spreading through the ship since the morning torpedo hit finally found their source of ignition. No one knows exactly what caused the spark. Perhaps electrical equipment, perhaps a carelessly discarded cigarette, perhaps just static electricity in the fuel-saturated air. The resulting explosion was devastating beyond anything the crew could have imagined or prepared for. It buckled the armored flight deck upward like cardboard, blew out the sides of the enclosed aircraft hangars with force that sent steel plates hundreds of feet into the air. Secondary explosions followed in rapid succession as aviation ordnance and fuel stores detonated throughout the stricken ship. At 4:28 in the afternoon, Taiho, the newest and most sophisticated carrier in the entire Japanese fleet, the ship commissioned just 3 months earlier that was supposed to represent the future of Japanese naval aviation, rolled on her beam ends and slipped beneath the Philippine Sea. Approximately 660 officers and enlisted men went down with their ship, including many of the highly skilled aircraft mechanics, ordnance handlers, and flight deck personnel that the Japanese naval aviation establishment could never adequately replace. Ozawa had already transferred his flag to a destroyer as Taiho began her death throes, watching his beautiful new ship die from a distance that offered safety but no comfort. He then made his way by small boat to the carrier Shokaku, one of his few undamaged flight decks, one of the few carriers that could still operate. Throughout these transfers, moving from ship to ship in open boats on a hostile sea, he remained convinced that his aircraft had inflicted serious damage on the American fleet. He believed the survivors had landed safely on Guam to refuel, rearm, and prepare for further attacks the following day, exactly as his operational plan had envisioned. Only when Ozawa finally reached Shokaku's flag bridge and received accurate reports from his remaining air group commanders did he begin to comprehend the true magnitude of the disaster that had befallen Japanese naval aviation. Of the 430 carrier aircraft with which he had begun that morning's operations, only 35 remained operational as darkness fell. 35 aircraft out of 430. His air groups had been annihilated. His carefully conceived plan had failed completely. The decisive battle he had sought had indeed proven decisive, but not in any way he had anticipated or could accept. The following day, June 20th, brought further losses to Ozawa's retreating fleet, though under circumstances that tested American resolve as severely as Japanese courage. American search aircraft finally located Ozawa's surviving carriers at 3:15 in the afternoon, approximately 300 miles to the west and moving away at high speed toward the relative safety of the Western Pacific. The tactical situation presented Mitcher with an agonizing decision that would define his legacy as a naval commander. 300 miles was extreme range for a carrier strike. The late afternoon hour meant that pilots would have to return after darkness had fallen, and the vast majority of American naval aviators had never attempted a night carrier landing. considered one of the most dangerous maneuvers in all of aviation, even for pilots who had trained specifically for it. Launching a strike under these conditions meant that many aircraft would return in total darkness to find their carriers. Significant numbers might be lost to fuel exhaustion or landing accidents. The pilots knew it. Mitchell knew it. Everyone knew it. Mitchell studied the tactical situation on his plotting board for only a few minutes before giving his order in a voice that betrayed no emotion. Get the carriers. 240 aircraft launched from 11 American carriers between 4:10 and 4:30 that afternoon, racing west toward the reported position at maximum speed. Shortly after the strike was airborne, a corrected position report from the scout planes revealed that the Japanese fleet was actually even farther away than initially calculated, located over 330 miles distant and still retreating. The pilots would be operating at the absolute limit of their fuel endurance, with virtually no margin for error. Many would not make it back. Mitchell considered the new information and chose not to recall the strike. The opportunity to cripple the Japanese fleet was too important. The cost would be high, but some opportunities came only once. The American attack achieved results that seemed modest compared to the previous day's aerial massacre, but were strategically significant nonetheless. The carrier Taiho was torpedoed and sank with approximately 250 of her crew. The carriers Shokaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda sustained bomb damage, but remained afloat and capable of further operations. 2 irreplaceable fleet oilers were destroyed, further crippling Japanese operational mobility. 20 American aircraft fell to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire during the attack itself. Pilots who would never see home again, who died attacking an enemy already beaten but still dangerous. Then came the desperate return flight that tested everything American naval aviation had built and believed about itself. As fuel gauges throughout the returning air groups dropped steadily toward empty in total darkness, pilots searched with increasing desperation for their carriers across miles of black Pacific Ocean. They had launched with full knowledge that the mission was at the extreme limit of fuel endurance. Now that theoretical risk became terrifying reality as engine after engine coughed, sputtered, and died. At approximately 8:30 that evening, Mitchell stood on his flag bridge watching the darkness and made the decision that would define his legacy. "Turn on the lights," he ordered quietly. The order violated every fundamental principle of naval operations in waters where enemy submarines were known to be operating. Illuminating the entire fleet made every ship a clearly visible target silhouetted against the dark ocean. Standing orders from Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the entire Pacific Fleet, specifically prohibited exactly this kind of dangerous exposure to submarine attack. Mitchell gave the order anyway, and every officer who heard understood what it meant. He was willing to risk the entire task force to bring his pilots home. Every ship in Task Force 58 turned on its running lights simultaneously. Powerful searchlights pointed toward the sky to create beacons visible for miles across the water. Star shells burst overhead at intervals, bathing the sea in harsh artificial light. Destroyers on the fleet perimeter fired parachute illumination flares. Individual sailors throughout the task force lined the rails with handheld flashlights, waving them toward the darkness where their pilots were running out of fuel and hope. One aviator who witnessed the stunning spectacle from his cockpit as he approached the fleet later described the scene as resembling a carnival or Mardi Gras celebration in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Robert Winston, watching from one of the carriers as the lights came on across the entire formation, recalled the moment vividly for the rest of his life. The men stood open-mouthed for several seconds at the sheer audacity of asking the enemy submarines to come and get us, he said. Then a spontaneous cheer went up from sailors across every ship. To hell with the submarines around us. Our boys are not expendable. The subsequent night recovery operations devolved into controlled chaos that pushed naval aviation to its absolute limits. Pilots running on empty fuel tanks attempted approaches on any ship that appeared to have a flight deck, regardless of whether it was their assigned carrier or even if they'd ever landed on that particular ship before. Exhausted aviators misjudged distances in the darkness, missed arresting wires, crashed into barriers. 18 aircraft were completely destroyed in deck landing accidents. Beautiful machines reduced to twisted wreckage that had to be pushed over the side to clear the deck for the next desperate pilot attempting to land. Others ditched deliberately alongside destroyers when their engines finally quit, their pilots gambling that rescue boats would reach them before sharks did or before they succumbed to exposure in the water. Of approximately 100 aircraft lost during the June 20th mission, 80 were lost to fuel exhaustion, ditching, and landing accidents rather than to enemy action. The skill and technology that had massacred Japanese formations the previous day could not overcome the fundamental physical limitations of fuel and darkness. But the rescue efforts that followed over the next 48 hours demonstrated values that distinguished American military culture in ways that mattered more than any tactical advantage. Destroyers and float planes scoured hundreds of square miles of ocean, searching for survivors. Pilots who had ditched in darkness were located by their dime markers and signal mirrors when daylight returned. Rescue operations continued for 2 full days, ships crisscrossing the search area repeatedly. 143 of the 185 aviators forced into the sea were recovered alive by persistent rescue efforts that refused to give up while any chance of finding survivors remained. 49 American airmen did not come home from a mission beyond darkness. But Mitchell had demonstrated in the most dramatic way possible that the United States Navy would accept extraordinary risks to bring its people back alive, that pilots were not expendable assets to be calculated in exchange ratios. Ozawa retreated toward Okinawa with the shattered remnants of what had been a powerful fleet. The decisive engagement he had expected would turn the tide of the Pacific War had instead destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force for the remainder of the conflict. The intensive training programs that had produced elite aviators in the years before Pearl Harbor could not be reconstituted under the pressures Japan now faced. The nation lacked sufficient fuel for adequate flight training, lacked experienced instructors to teach new pilots, and lacked the time necessary to rebuild what had been destroyed. The strategic consequences cascaded rapidly through every aspect of the Japanese war effort. Within weeks of the defeat, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government collapsed from power, replaced by leaders who privately understood that the war was essentially lost but could not identify any path to an acceptable peace. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, just 4 months later, Ozawa's surviving carriers were deliberately employed as sacrificial decoys, openly exposed to draw American carrier forces away from the Philippine landing beaches. The carriers that sortied for Leyte Gulf carried only 108 operational aircraft among 6 ships, a pitiful fraction of former strength. Ozawa went into that engagement fully expecting and accepting that his force would be destroyed because serving as a sacrificial distraction was the only remaining useful function his depleted carriers could perform. The first organized kamikaze suicide attacks began at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, representing an explicit institutional acknowledgement that Japanese pilots could no longer effectively compete against Americans in conventional aerial combat. Sending young men to deliberately crash their explosive-laden aircraft into enemy ships was not a tactic any nation would choose if viable alternatives existed. By the spring of 1945, kamikaze pilot training had been compressed to approximately 7 days of instruction. Recruits learned to take off, fly in basic formation toward a target, and execute a terminal dive. They did not need to learn how to land their aircraft because they were never expected to return. The Mariana Islands that American forces secured in the immediate wake of the Philippine Sea victory became the primary launching platforms for the strategic bombing campaign that devastated the Japanese home islands. The 29 Superfortress bombers operating from bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam brought the full destructive power of American industry directly to Japanese cities. The catastrophic firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 and the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August launched from runways that American construction battalions began building within weeks of the carrier battle. The lesson of what happened on June 19th and 20th, 1944, extends far beyond the specific tactical and operational details of naval warfare. Ozawa and the Japanese High Command made exactly the same catastrophic analytical error that military and political leaders have repeated throughout recorded history. They measured their enemy by what they expected and wanted to find rather than by what actually existed in reality. They saw American industrial capacity and assumed that mere quantity could never compensate for Japanese fighting spirit and warrior tradition. They remembered the supremely skilled elite aviators who had swept victoriously through the Pacific in 1941 and completely failed to recognize that those exceptional men were dead, replaced by undertrained novices flying into a technological trap their commanders did not understand and had not prepared them to survive. The Americans that Ozawa's pilots faced in June 1944 were not the same Americans who had struggled through the desperate early months of the Pacific War. 2.5 years of continuous combat had produced pilots who knew their aircraft intimately, understood their enemy's specific weaknesses, and had learned through hard and bloody experience precisely how to survive and kill. The industrial might that Japanese planners had dismissed as mere quantity had produced revolutionary weapons that transformed quantity into decisive qualitative advantage. Radar provided warning that made surprise impossible. Proximity fuses multiplied anti-aircraft effectiveness manifold. The Hellcat fighter dominated every engagement. Sophisticated organizational systems coordinated hundreds of aircraft simultaneously through combat information centers, achieving levels of precision that Japanese forces could not approach. Ozawa sailed confidently into battle, believing that traditional Japanese spirit would triumph over American machines and material. He discovered that spirit, however sincere and however bravely demonstrated by individual pilots, could not compensate for aviators who lacked the training to survive against a thoroughly prepared enemy flying superior aircraft in coordinated tactics. On June 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of Taiho and believed he was about to win the decisive battle that would save the Japanese Empire. By sunset, his Navy's ability to fight carrier battles had ceased to exist. The warriors were gone. The carriers were sinking. The dream of victory had died somewhere over the Philippine Sea, shot to pieces by an enemy that had learned, adapted, and grown stronger while Japan had grown weaker. The day Japan's Navy died was not a single moment of catastrophic defeat like Midway had been. It was a slow, methodical destruction of men and machines and hope itself. A turkey shoot where one side brought overwhelming advantages to an engagement the other side thought would be fair. Admiral Ozawa would survive the war. He would live to see his nation defeated, occupied, transformed. He would die in 1966 at the age of 79, having witnessed the complete transformation of the world he had fought for. But the Navy he commanded died on June 19, 1944, in the waters of the Philippine Sea, and nothing could bring it back.